Hello everyone, welcome back to CodeLabs 2018 Summer Edition. Again, not that we actually have a winter edition anymore. We haven't for years, but welcome back. It's great to have you all with us, and really excited to get started with the workshop today. So today what we're going to be talking about is how to make a website that is more interactive, is more cool, and is just generally more of everything than maybe static HTML, CSS, the stuff that you might have learned either at yesterday's workshop or that you might have learned years ago just from messing around. Making static HTML and putting it on a web page, and maybe you can even use JavaScript, and that's all great, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with that, but it's not quite the same as doing really cool stuff with dynamic websites, stuff where we can actually make websites do more dramatic things than we might be able to do with just JavaScript. Things like loading data from a database or saving data to a database. Things like rendering things using templates so that multiple pages can use the same thing. All sorts of cool stuff like that. And so we're going to talk about how to do that, and we are going to together, as an example, learn to make really cool websites. And we're also going to learn a little bit more about how the web works at the very introductory level, just really basics. We actually covered some of this in the hacking workshop last week. And by the end of this, hopefully we're going to come out of this with some really cool websites. And by really cool, I mean probably really basic and not very complicated at all, but it'll still be cool that we did it together. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we actually do get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is involved in HTTP and sort of how the web actually works at a deeper level than you might have learned before. To do that, we're going to, before we actually get into installing anything, before we actually get into talking about that, I'm actually going to have you install some things, though, if you haven't already. So what you need to search for is Python, pip, and then the name of your operating system. Pip as in PIP. So let's say that I wanted to install this for Mac. What I need to do is install Python, and I need to install this thing called pip. And the easiest way to do both of those things is quite simply to Google it. And you can see that, for example, on Mac, all you need to do is open up a terminal and do sudo easy install pip. Because as you see over here in this thing we're going to get to later, you're going to need to be able to run this command pip to install another program. So we're going to be using Python. If you haven't used Python before, don't worry about it. It's a really great introductory level language, but you do need to make sure that it's installed and that pip is installed. If you're running Windows, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, as is everything if you're running Windows. I apologize. That is more or less the way that Windows works, is they make everything more complicated if you want to just be a developer. So if you do want to do things on Windows, again, Python, pip, PIP, and then Windows, and you'll find information as well about installing pip on Windows. It just takes a little bit more time, a little bit more effort. So especially if you're using Windows, go ahead and you can kind of tune out this next part and worry about getting it installed. If you're lucky, you already have all of this installed, and we're not going to have to worry about it at all. So before we go into in detail how we're actually going to create a web server that does more dynamic things, I want to first talk a little bit about what exactly, like how a web server works, and in a little bit more detail than perhaps you are familiar with from, if you've done some things with like creating a static HTML page and putting it in a folder and telling your web server what folder that is. You're probably used to, okay, if I go to /test.html, it'll load this test.html file and it'll return it back to the web browser. But what exactly is your web server doing? And maybe more importantly than that, what even is a web server? What does it mean for something to be a web server? So conceptually, all a web server is a program that runs on a computer and understands how to talk in this standardized format that we call HTTP. And you've probably heard of HTTP because it goes at the beginning of a lot of your URLs. That is all a web server is. It's a program that listens for connections that are speaking HTTP, which is, again, just sort of a standard that we've come up with. And in fact, like you can even see HTTP, I think it's an RFC. Yeah. So you can actually find this document that's kind of like, if you've ever heard of a peer review journal, we kind of have a public access peer review journal for all web standards. And not that I would ever recommend that you actually read this entire thing unless you're really interested in it and you get a lot more knowledge. But in fact, HTTP is just basically this document that was released in 1999 for the most recent version. And it is just some specifications about how things work. Now, again, I'm not going to have you read all of this because, again, it's really, really long. It's just kind of cool to know that it is an open source thing. But what we're going to actually do is we're going to explore a little bit about what HTTP looks like so that we can kind of understand how a web server might work. So before we go any further, I'm going to just do this. You can follow along if you want. If you're running Mac, this should be built in. I don't think it's built into Windows anymore, but there's no reason to. You don't need to follow along. You can just watch this. So what we're going to do is, let's say that we want to go to example.com. Example.com is an example domain, and it's pretty much what it says on the tin. It is an example website, and it is required by specification to work. And it happens to be an easy one because it doesn't have HTTPS. Now, we could do this with any website in existence as long as it's not HTTPS. And the reason for that is solely just because we can't manually encrypt things. It's too difficult. We'd have to write a program to it. But we can manually connect to this website, example.com, which is not encrypted. Again, it's http://example.com. And that's how you can tell that it is an HTTP website, not an HTTPS. So the way that we're going to connect to this website ourselves is we're going to type telnet example.com 80. Now, what does 80 mean? It's the web port. And I think next week we're actually going to have a website on how the internet works, and we can talk about what a port actually means. But conceptually, all you need to think of as a port is a program that's listening for things that are marked with this number 80 in a specific spot. So we're going to type telnet example.com 80, and what we're doing now is we are talking directly to the program that is running on the example.com computer that is called a web server. And what we're going to type is http:/1.1 get/ oh, sorry, I messed that up, reverse the order. So again, we're going to telnet, it's clear. We're going to telnet into example.com 80. We're going to type get/ http:/1.1. So what we're doing is we're getting example.com/ whatever, right? And so if we were to do, for example, example.com/blog, which does not exist, what we would type is, there we would type /blog, right? So get /blog http:/1.1, for example. Now, if we just do a plain old /, that means that nothing is being connected to at all. We're just connecting to whatever the default page is this thing wants to give us. We'll do blog for this example, just because I think it'll work anyway. http:/1.1, what does that mean? Well, HTTP, and it is version 1.1, which was again released in 1999. There is a version 2 that is kind of in development. We're not going to use that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to type host:/example.com. And what does that tell it? Well, it just tells it what domain name we're trying to connect to, because originally the domain name system did not exist, and so it was kind of hacked on top of HTTP. And we're going to hit enter twice, and what it is going to give back to us is the HTML from the web page that we requested, which again in this case was /blog. I think with example.com pretty much /anything should work. And you can also see some information up here. You can actually see that this was a 404 file not found, but even though it was not found, it was still returned the exact same text. 404 file not found, right? You've probably heard that expression before. And that is exactly where it comes from, is that in this HTTP thing, which is again just kind of an agreed upon format that computers and web browsers can both talk to each other, that is where it comes from. A 404 is the error code, and not found is the error message, which is a human readable version of the error code. As long as you speak English, it's human readable in any case. Again, we have this http:/1.1, which means the web server understands the version we're talking about. It's got the date. It's got a bunch of other information. And then it returns the actual HTML, which is the stuff that you would be using in a web page. So why is this important? Well, conceptually, this is all HTTP is. This is not, Telnet is not some sort of fancy program that's doing all sorts of weird stuff to, you know, automatically convert this into HTTP or anything like that. This is HTTP. This is all HTTP is. That's it. It is this format that we have just talked to. And yes, it is really that simple. You can literally type it yourself, right? It's not anything complicated. I could write down an HTTP request on a piece of paper and mail it to someone. And as long as they understood what HTTP was, they could respond back in the exact same format. It's really, really simple. And it is literally plain text. Again, unless we're encrypting things like HTTPS. So given that this is so simple, and that this is something that we can, you know, again, it's just a text format. When you use something like Apache or Nginx, which, you know, you give it a folder path and you upload your HTML files to that folder path and it automatically loads them, all Apache or Nginx is doing, the only thing it is doing, is it's understanding how to talk in this format. And it is then internally in its own code, going out to that file folder, seeing if there's a page by that name, and then returning back the content to that page. That's all it's doing. So it is conceptually a program. It is nothing special. We could write our own program that behaves exactly like Apache or Nginx, and the only reason why those are still used is, one, legacy reasons, and two, because they're heavily optimized to be as fast as possible for returning back those static assets, the things that don't ever change, the static HTML or the static PNG or whatever else. That's the only reason. But conceptually, all they're doing is they're speaking in this exact same format that we're speaking in. And in fact, sometimes, okay, so this is using server ECS, and we could even search for this, server ECS. It actually adds that sort of metadata, and I don't know exactly what this is. This is some weird web server that I've never used. But if we were using Apache, it would actually even add server Apache, or if we're using Nginx, it would add server Nginx. Unless you remove it by default. There's no reason for it to be there. But again, like the point is just that the web server actually just understands these requests in this format, and it responds with these requests in this format, right? Where we have the headers up here, and then we have two spaces, and then we have the HTML itself. So why is this important? This is important because we can do the same thing ourselves. We can write a program that understands these formats, and then we can, from there, actually make more dynamic things happen with our websites. That's all we need to do. It's really cool. And in fact, if you've used something like PHP, you've probably seen, for example, people can actually have, you know, a bunch of different files and, you know, example.php, example2.php, you know, like login.php or whatever else, and you can have a web server go out and execute that code every single time. But again, conceptually, there's no reason to do that, and in some sense, that's actually overcomplicating things. All we're going to do in this example is we're going to write a simple Python program that receives requests that are in the HTTP format, and it processes those requests and just runs a function. So instead of, you know, loading a static HTML website, all we're going to do is it's going to run a function, and that function is just, it's going to return the output of that function to the web browser. Because again, it's just a really simple format. And in fact, because HTTP is so common and it's such a commonly used thing, what we're actually going to do is we're not even going to write our own parser for HTTP. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to use one of the many, many ones that have been written for us to do it for us. And the one that we're going to use is called Flask. So the way that we're going to install Flask, again, you need two things. You need Python installed, which I have. What is it? Quit. So you need Python, which I have installed, and then you need to install Flask. And what I'll do is I will copy pip install Flask. I'll just paste it. And it will go ahead and install that for me. And if you're following along with me, this is the time to go ahead and get started. Again, hopefully you've installed pip by now, and hopefully you have Python installed as well, which pip wouldn't work without it. So again, what we did was pip install Flask. Flask, and I think it needs a capital F. I'm not totally sure if it works with a lowercase. Okay, so now what we're going to do, now that I have Flask installed, is we're going to open a text editor. Now again, this is something that I've talked about in previous workshops. I'm going to use a text editor called Vim because it's what I'm familiar with and because I'm using Linux and it's easy. You can use any text editor you want as long as it's not like Microsoft Word. It has to be a very basic text editor which only creates text, no special formatting. So some common ones are GitHub Atom ATOM. Another common one is Sublime Text. There's another one that's pretty common called Visual Studio Code. Again, I'm going to use Vim. If you're familiar with Vim, feel free to use it. If you have never used Vim before, I would recommend against it, just because it's going to be a little bit more complicated. There's a lot of shortcuts. Vim is entirely shortcut driven. There's no menus, basically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to type Vim, and I'm just going to call it index.py. Now, as with anything, as with any situation with programming where we're doing something that maybe you haven't done before, a really good reference to use, a really good way to do things is to actually look at the documentation and see what the documentation has to say about how to do this. So in this case, we have this documentation right here, and it's got this really simple demo. And whenever I'm looking at programming frameworks, by the way, this is one of the first things I always want to look at. Someone was just asking in the chat, by the way, is this going to be replayable? It will. This will be uploaded to YouTube. It'll also be on the Twitch archive. So we have this demo thing. And again, whenever I'm looking at any programming language, I'm always looking for simple demos because it's a really good way to understand, is this something I want to even do? And a really good place, actually, to start off with is to just go ahead and copy and paste this. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to paste it, and then we'll go through name by name, line by line, and see if we can figure out what it's doing. So first of all, this is an import. If you've ever used Java and you have packages where you have to use the packages, similar deal. If you've ever used C# and you have to use the using, XYZ, same deal. Same with PHP and namespaces, everything else. Python has got this. What we're doing is we're saying we're going to use this Flask library that we installed a moment earlier with that pip install Flask command. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to what's called instantiate a new Flask object. So what we're doing basically is we're starting up a new web server. We're starting up a brand new web server, and we're just giving it a name, which is by default this __ name thing means the name of the file because it needs a name. It doesn't really matter what's going on. Again, we're creating this into a new variable. If you've used something like Java or C#, you might be familiar with it saying the word new here. And if you haven't used Python before, basically Python does not require that. The second thing we're doing, and I'm going to just go ahead and delete this for right now, we're going to just make a function. And this function will be whatever we want it to return to the web browser, right? So in this case, it says def hello world. This is how we make a function in Python. But let's just go ahead and delete that for right now, and we'll make our own. So someone was asking in the chat for the YouTube URL. Let's make a function that go ahead and it returns the YouTube URL. So like any other function that we would do in the in programming, we'll give it a name. Def YouTube. And in Python, rather than using curly braces, in Python we use this and then we indent. So def YouTube, and what we're going to do is we're going to return the URL, which is https youtube.com/studentrnd, right? So we have this function. Now the next thing we need to do is, again, remember an HTTP request looks something like this. Get/YouTube http/1.1, right? Now obviously this is not the important part. The important part is this get and this /YouTube. How do we tell Flask, which is going to handle parsing this all out for us, that we want this function to be the YouTube URL, right? And someone pointed out in chat that maybe it should be called YouTube URL. So we can go ahead and do that. And actually the Pythonish way of doing this is with underscores. It's actually called snake case if you use these underscores in some places. So we'll call it YouTube URL. How do we tell Flask that we want to map it to that? Well, Flask has this really cool format where we basically do this @app.route. And conceptually what this is doing is really complicated. Don't worry about it. What it's doing is it's kind of like wrapping this function in another function, and it's like really, really complicated. Don't worry about it too much. But what we're going to do is we're going to do @app.route. So I'll just type that out again for anyone who's following on, @app.route. And what this does is it points to, it tells Flask that, hey, whenever you see a request that looks like whatever's inside these parentheses, so if we, what is YouTube, we say this is going to be what is YouTube, that's going to tell Flask, hey, Flask, whenever you see a page that says /what is YouTube, like example.com/whatisyoutube. Perhaps it should be called what is YouTube URL. This is really long, so I'm just going to say YouTube, YT. Whenever we see this URL that is /YT, run this function and return back to the web browser whatever the value is of that function. So we're going to go ahead and just leave it at that. And I'll leave this text editor open a new window, srnd Flask. And I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run python index.py. Why did that not work? Because we didn't tell it what to do. So we'll do it this way. There's another way to do this. Don't worry about it for right now. We've named our thing index.py. We're going to say Flask run. What is the other way to do this? Let's see if we can find an example. Flask run main. Here we go. I think it might just be, let's see if we can try this. So what we need to do now is, basically we've made this entire thing. We can run it this way. We can tell Flask that we want it to actually run the web server by doing it this way. I think we can also do app.run. Let's see if this works. Cool, it does. So all we need to do is we'll just paste app.run at the very bottom under our entire thing. And then what we're saying is we're gonna, whenever we start this Python program, we will run the web server by default. Because in theory, we could use this for all sorts of other things as well. No audio coming through. There should be audio coming through. Make sure that your mic isn't muted. Someone was just asking about that. I haven't heard any problems from anyone else. And I believe that if I were to unmute myself, I would be able to hear it as well. I can actually just do this way. So we'll just go ahead and double check that I can hear myself. Oh, I got an advertisement, so that's annoying. But it did seem like I can hear myself, so I'm pretty sure that was, just go ahead and make sure you're not muted. Okay, so we're gonna keep going on from here. And again, if anyone has any questions for right now, feel free to post them in the Twitch chat. But if you want to watch this later, again, it's going to be on YouTube. And then if you are watching it on YouTube and you have some questions, chat.srnd.org. We got this really big community of people, and we are all happy to help each other out and make sure that you, if you have any questions, we can answer them live. There's a bunch of people who will be able to answer your questions. So chat.srnd.org is definitely the place to go if you're watching this on a rerun. Okay, so what we've done now is we've got this whole thing set up so that whenever we run app.run, it just goes ahead and it starts up the Flask server. So if I just run this program, and again, if you're using an IDE, maybe you even have a play button, but if not, on Windows, for example, I think you can just double-click a Python program and it'll start running as long as you have Python installed. And on Mac, you could open up the terminal and type python index.py or whatever you've named it. And it'll go ahead and it'll say, debug mode is off, okay, whatever. Do not use development server, okay, whatever. Running on, and then it's got this URL right here. So we're going to go ahead and just copy this URL. Oops, I hit Control-C, which cancels the running the program. So we'll copy this URL, and we'll go back to our browser, and we'll just paste it. And okay, we got a not found, right? So why is the reason? Well, it's because we do /YT. So it's this URL /YT. And you can see, if I zoom in, right here, that is the result of our function, right there. Now, this is not the most exciting thing in the world, but this is a starting point. We can do much more complicated things. So let's start trying out some of those more complicated things. The first thing we can do is that this function is just returning a string right now. But how do you make a website? Again, you make a website in HTML. And if you don't know HTML, we did a really basic introductory workshop on that yesterday. Again, feel free to check it out on our YouTube page. But what we're going to do is let's make a link. So ahref equals, we use single quotes because we're already using double quotes for this string. So we'll use an A, and maybe we say, this is where it goes to, and then the text is YouTube. I'll go ahead and cancel this and restart it so that we get the newest version. And if I refresh, hey, look at that, we get this link. Very exciting, right? the most exciting thing in the world. And it'll go to our YouTube page. Yeah, not exactly the most exciting thing in the world, but that's okay. It's a starting point, right? So we got this function. Again, it's not the world's most exciting function in the world, but what we can do is we can make another page. So first of all, if you notice, again, if I went back to this just slash page, the one where we don't specify a specific subpage, we do not found error. How would we get around that? So what we would do is we'd do an app.route, and we would just say, this is for the slash page. This is for when no other page is specified. That's how we're going to go ahead and start out what's going on here. So we get this app.route slash, and we're just kind of explaining, like, you know, this is the default page. Now what we could do is we could return anything we wanted. So we could just return hi there, right? If we wanted to make it really big, again, this is HTML, we could return it in this H1, which is the biggest heading in an HTML page. And again, this needs to be wrapped inside of a function, so I actually typed that wrong. What we're going to do is we're going to do def, and we're going to call it, you know, greeter. Or we could, you know, we can call it whatever we want. We can call it index. We can call it this long random string. It doesn't actually matter. The only thing that actually matters is this app.route, which kind of maps it between the two. So we're going to call it greeter. Return h1, hi there. We'll go ahead and restart and start again our web server. So stop the old one, start a new one. Again, if you're running this on your own Python, it's either Control-C if you're doing it in or Command-C if you're doing it in a terminal, or if you're doing it on the desktop on Windows, I think you can just double-click. If you're using an IDE like PyCharm, which is a greatly recommended one, you should just even have a play button and a stop button. So we'll go ahead and we'll refresh now and check that out. We got this really beautiful web page here, right? Okay, so we've got this thing, which again, we've moved from this model of we have to have static HTML websites somewhere. You know, the static HTML pages have to be saved to a file and they're put in a specific folder, and we use Apache or Nginx. We've now moved to this model where we have, you know, we have this really cool new, you know, this format where we're writing functions. Well, what does that mean? Because right now what we're doing is we're doing really boring things. We're just returning the static, you know, strings, which is not really moving us that further forward. If anything, we've just overcomplicated our entire life. Well, here are some cool things we can do with this. First of all, we can actually start to write functions which do more complicated things. So, has anyone here heard of the Fibonacci sequence? Fibonacci sequence, again, being a, you know, it's basically you take two numbers, start off with 1 and 1. Let's go ahead and I'll just write it out here, right? Start off with 1, 1. And then what you do is you just add the last two numbers together. So we get 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 8 plus 5 I think is 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, right? It's the Fibonacci sequence. Fibonacci sequence, something that would be really easy to write a function to do, right? So we could write a function called calculate fib, and we'll take in as a parameter a number. So like how many, let's call it count, right? And what would be the way to calculate the Fibonacci sequence? There's a bunch of ways to do this. The easiest way, if we don't want to actually derive this ourselves, because that's not what this workshop is about, is to just Google Fibonacci sequence Python. That's going to be the absolute easiest way to do that. Now, if you are an actual programmer, hopefully you would actually learn how to write this, and maybe sometime we'll do a workshop about how to do some of these really basic programming questions that you might get asked in an interview, and you could actually think through the entire problem and come up with a way to solve it. And I think that might be a workshop that we'll do later. But in the real world, when you're an actual programmer, often the thing that you'll want to do is quite simply Google it and see if someone else has solved it, because it saves you a lot of time. And if you're an actual programmer, your employers are paying you a lot of money, and they don't want to be spending a lot of time, spending a lot of money. So what we can do, they use the parameter n. So we'll call ours n, but I do want to call it calculate fib, because I think that's a little bit more of a descriptive name, and I like my functions to be named very descriptively, because then someone sees it, and we don't even really need to comment here, because what does this function does? Well, it calculates the Fibonacci sequence. So we have this calculate fib function. What it will do is it will take any number, and it will really actually quite inefficiently, if you look at the way that this works, we'll really inefficiently calculate a Fibonacci sequence. So now what we can do is we can make a page, which is called getFib. Doesn't take any parameters. We'll talk about how to make it take parameters later. But what we can do is we can have it get fib, right? It will get the Fibonacci sequence. So we can copy and paste the rest of their thing, the part where it actually prints out the Fibonacci sequence. And what it will do is it will return basically what we'll do is the way that this is working is it's saying, hey, take this function. We can we'll write it this way: for range 4x in range. I don't remember the Python way to do a for loop. By the way, this is another thing. I've written a lot of Python in my life. I haven't written Python in probably a year or two, so I just forget some of the syntax. And that is a thing that's really common. The nice thing about being a programmer is that hopefully you continue to program, and so once you see the syntax, then you remember. So it is for x in range 0 to, let's say, 20, because this is going to be fairly slow. Print calculate fib. The way that it was recommending doing it on Stack Overflow was a little bit more complicated way of doing it, but it was much nicer. I'm not going to go too much into it right now. So we're going to calculate the Fibonacci sequence of number x, and then we're just going to print it out. And again, what we want to do is we want to map this to a page. So app.route, we'll just call this /fib. Right? So we've got this function that actually calculates it for any arbitrary number. We've got this function that should just print the Fibonacci sequence. And I guess what we'll also need to do is append a space, because we need a space. And I think that this might have a bug, but we'll go ahead and try it and see if it works. So what we can do now that we've got this all working is we'll do /fib. Yes, this does actually have a bug. Whenever you see a bug, this won't give you any errors on the web browser, and the reason for that is quite simply it could be a security problem. Maybe you have like a super secure string there. So you actually have to go to your server logs and see what's going on. And what we can see is we can't add an integer in a string, which is kind of what I thought was going to be wrong. So what we'll do is we'll just convert this to a string. The way we do that in Python, I believe, again, I haven't done this in years, is we just drop it in a call to the method str. Go ahead and restart it, refresh. What error do we have now? Because we did not return anything, right? So this function needs to return it. We can't just print it like we would on a console command. Again, this is live debugging, so this is fun. So we'll create a new variable, we'll call it output, and it will just be an empty string. What we can do is we can we can take the output is equal to output plus the Fibonacci sequence, and then what we'll do is we'll return output. And now you can see why perhaps that other way of doing it was a little bit more concise. And oh, check that out, we've got all of our Fibonacci sequences. It started with 0 in their case, which is another thing I have seen people do, started with 0, 1 instead of 1, 1. I don't remember what is the mathematically correct way to do it. I am not a mathematician. But you can see, again, we got basically the Fibonacci sequence that we came up with before. Now what's another way to do that? Well, we can actually, again, what we can do is this is HTML, so we can actually make this some LIs, right? This is getting to be a really long line, and with this large font size, doesn't quite work, but that's okay. So we'll start out with a UL for an unordered list, and then we'll output plus /UL. I'm not using any of the too fancy Python concatenation things, just in case you're not familiar with them, but if you are, and you're like, why isn't he doing this the simpler way? It's because I didn't want to, because I wanted to keep it simple. So there we go. Now we get our list, right? This is really cool. It's not really that cool. I mean, I think if you showed this to any of your friends, they would probably be like, why are you doing this? Like, what But again, example of the things that we can do, because you can see how maybe this could be generalized to other things. We could go out, for example, and let's say you're really into like Overwatch, and you want to go and get the Overwatch rankings for your character, right? You could make a page that, for example, displays the Overwatch rankings for your character. All you would need to do is find somewhere on the internet where those exist, which I'm assuming it does. I don't know. I don't play Overwatch either. And, go out and get that page, find your character's name, and then, you could do all of this in Python code. And then we would actually get this really cool, you do that, which would probably be a lot more useful, because then maybe on your personal website you could say, hey, here's my Overwatch ranking, right? Or for example, if you're using Spotify, Spotify has an API, which is something we'll talk about in a workshop, I think, next week. Spotify has an API where you could get to whatever song you're listening to right now. And so on your website, you could actually maybe put a place where it lists your currently listening song. So again, this is just a really simple example that we can do that doesn't require lots and lots of extra work, but you can see how we've moved from this model of static HTML to actually, having a function run and calculate things. So the very next step that we maybe want to do, and I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this. Very next step that we want to do is I want to just simplify this a little bit, just because ideally what I want to do is I want to turn this into something that's a little bit more dynamic, and that's a really long function. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it this other way, the way that they've done it over in this Stack Overflow post. What we're going to do is we're going to join all the Fibonacci sequences with a comma. I think that we do it, don't remember which way we do it. Join Python. I think it's this way. Yes. So we tell it what string we want to use to sort of concatenate all these things together, to join them all together in Python first, and then we call .join on it. I know that's confusing if you're not used to seeing it, if maybe you've used something like PHP or anything, but everything in Python is an object including strings. So all we have is we have the string, and we say that it's going to be a comma and a space, and then we join everything together with that comma and space. What are we going to join? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to run the function calculate fib on every number from 0 to 50. Or what do we do, like 20? So we're going to calculate the fib for 0, and then for 1, and then for 2, and then for 3. We're going to do that over and over. That's what this map function does. And for each one of those things, each one of those numbers from 0 to 20, it's going to pass it into the calculate fib function. And then when it's got all of them, it's going to be an array or a list or whatever you want to call it for whatever programming language you're used to. And then we're going to join them all with this thing. And this should work. What did I do wrong? Invalid syntax. Did something wrong. Am I missing? I'm missing an end parenthesis. We'll see if this works. We got an error. Sequence item 0 expected string. Right, because we have to, again, convert each one of these things to a string. This is going to be a little bit more complicated. Let's do this. Join. We'll run a second one. We'll run a second map function, which takes any input and it converts it to a string. Again, this is getting to be a complicated line. If you have the other one, feel free to just use it as it is. Cool. So now what we've done is we've got this list of numbers. And actually, here's, maybe let's try an easier way that might be a little bit, I'm just kind of thinking through this on the fly. So we'll join an array that is composed of string, calculate fib, of n for n in range 0, 20. I think that might be a little bit more clear, right? So we have this, this array. We can actually do it this way. We'll use an intermediate variable, right? Or a temporary variable. Fib. What this is going to do is it's going to make an array it's going to make an array of, basically what it's going to do, basically what Python is going to do is it's going to make an array of 0 to 20. And then for each number in that array, which we're going to call n, it's going to call the string function, and it's going to call the calculate fib function. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return comma space dot join fib. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that array and we're going to turn it back into a string. And I think this is a little bit more clear what we're doing. And it does work. So someone was asking about JavaScript, by the way. We will get to that in the Q&A. I think that's a really good question. Yeah, so we'll talk about it in the Q&A, but that is a really great question. And by the way, you kind of can use JavaScript instead of Python on the back end using something called Node.js. It's a little bit more complicated. We're not going to get into that too much in this workshop. But it is a good question. We'll talk about that in the Q&A, because in some situations, maybe it is better to use JavaScript. Okay, So we get this getFib function. Now what we want to do is that, well, we've got this function that's a little bit more concise, so that we can actually really see what's going on. And you could leave it the other way. I just wanted to make it this way so that you as people here could see what's going on in one line. What we want to do is this only returns the Fibonacci sequence for the 20, the first 20 elements of that sequence. What we ideally want to do instead is we want to return the Fibonacci sequence for any arbitrary one. Any arbitrary one. And there's a security problem with that, which we'll talk about in a sec. But what we can do then is we can take things as parameters. So you've probably seen this before. I can't quite show you there, so I'll type it out over here. We could go HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 5000. The URL that it gave us /fib. And we could do something like n equals 100. Right? N equals 100 as a question mark, and then maybe that'll get us the 100th element. How will we do that in Flask? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for Flask Get Parameters. Because again, being a programmer is partially that the things that you use all the time, you remember how to use them, but it's also partially the things that you don't use all the time, you get good at Googling them. That is partially what it is about. So how do we do this? Well, it looks like we need to import this thing up here. So we'll paste that in. And then what we do, now that we have this request variable, we can do request.args.get. So n is equal to request.args.get n. What this will do is whatever is in that n equals part of after the question mark in the URL, it'll assign it to this variable n, and then the Fibonacci sequence will be calculated on that. So instead of for range 0 to 20, we can do range 0 to n. So we'll go ahead and start this again. And when I refresh this with no n, it should just give me an error, I think. But if I give this an n is equal to 100, oh, we still got an error. What's the error? Because it is by default a string. Because everything is a string, it doesn't know it's a number. We could have done n is equal to foo, right? We could have done n is equal to an emoji. It would be happy to try to deal with that. So what we actually need to do is we need to convert it to a number. And I think in Python, it's not num, is it int? It's int. So we'll convert it to a number from a string. We'll refresh, and you can see that it'll take a few seconds because the way that this function is calculating it is very slow. And in fact, maybe I even want to cancel this because this is going to take too long. Try n is equal to 20, restart our server, and you can see, okay, n is equal to 20. 21, 22, and you can see so on and so forth again. 1, 2. Now, again, as I mentioned, there's a security problem with this, which is really conceptually different from the sort of things that you get with conventional make a static HTML page somewhere, right? This is where a lot of the security problems in applications come from, is thinking through problems like this that wouldn't immediately be obvious. And I do want to get into this really briefly just because this is really, really important. When you put a website on, the web that's using this form of programming, where when someone makes a web request, it is running a function, and that function is running on a computer that you own, there could be problems. They could be giving you things that you don't expect, and it's really important that you check that. Because if you're giving someone a .exe file, right, and they're running it on their own computer, all they could potentially do is mess up their own computer. In this case, they could mess up your computer. So what are some of the problems with this? Well, again, one of them is that I could just give it a really big number. If I give it 10,000 as the number, what's going to happen is this function, the way that we've written the Fibonacci sequence, is really inefficient. And there's more efficient ways to run it. I'm not going to get into that too much. That's another workshop maybe sometime about big O notation. It's a really stupid way of running it. But basically, as the number gets bigger, the amount of calculations required are going to increase exponentially. So 20 to 21 is actually going to take twice as many calculations to figure out. A little bit more than twice as many. My computer is actually getting, like, the fan has kicked on. I don't think you can hear it on the microphone, but the fan has kicked on while it tries to calculate out this Fibonacci sequence to 10,000 decimal places, which again is many, many, many times bigger than calculating it out for 20. Now, if someone else wants to calculate it out for 2 at the same time, okay, well, that's kind of fine. But maybe we have a bunch of these running. And now someone else wants to calculate it out for 2. It's doing better than I thought. But potentially, eventually, if you do enough of this, it could actually prevent other people from using the website. That's called a DOS attack, a denial of service attack. Because what's going on right now is if I run a process manager, is that 2 of my CPUs are actually like really being hit hard. Now it's distributing it across 4 of them, but I'm using 50% CPU on all 4 of my cores, and this is a computer from last year, and I'm not streaming on this computer. I'm streaming from a different computer. It's just being captured through the HDMI port. So this is really bad. So that's one problem. I'm gonna go ahead and just cancel this so all those requests stop. Another problem is maybe we give it a really weird input that it's not expecting, like -30. Now, in this case, it just sort of, I think x in range 0 to -30 just does nothing. It returns 0. But you could have potentially other problems, right? Maybe you're loading a file and you ask it for a file name, right? And you're loading a file from some particular folder. And for that file name, you give it ... Well, if for anyone who's used Linux or Mac knows, ... means move up a folder. So they could be reading out, your social security number that happens to be stored in your My Documents folder. There's all sorts of problems with this. So just do keep in mind with this thing, you are opening up entirely new security holes that you wouldn't have if it was static HTML and JavaScript, because those are running on their computer. This is running on your computer. There's a lot of other problems with that. If you're interested, go ahead and check out our hacking workshop from last week on our YouTube page or our Twitch archives for as long as it's up. But there are a lot of problems that you could have with doing it this way. But there's a lot of cool things you can do with it this way too. Okay, so now we've got it with again, we've got this thing where we can give it this n 20, and we get out this number. We can do n of 10. We get out that number as well. This is kind of ugly. Personally, I think this, again, this question mark n is equal to 100, right? Wouldn't it be cool if instead of doing it that way, we could do something like /fib/10. Wouldn't it be cool? What would be the naive way of doing that? Right. The naive way of doing that would be maybe we could make another function, get fib10, right? And we copy and paste all this. We're going to range 0 to 10, and we do an app.route /fib/10, and maybe we copy and paste all this again. We do fib/20, and if we run this, it should work. /10/20. What's the problem with this? The problem with doing it this way, for anyone who's ever been a programmer of any sort, you probably noticed that it's nice to be lazy. The less work you have to do, the better. And this is not just you as a student, perhaps in school. This is you as a programmer. People are paying you possibly a lot of money. Starting salaries for programmers can sometimes be upward of $20,000 a year. People are $200,000 a year. So people are paying you a lot of money to do this, and they want you to be lazy. You want to be lazy. Copying and pasting a bunch of code for every number someone could possibly want to calculate the Fibonacci sequence on, of which there are an infinite number, that's bad. So instead, what we could actually do, though, is remember that we're just telling Flask that we're going to run a function with a certain parameter. We're going to run a function based on whatever URL we're giving it, whatever this one parameter of that HTTP request is, right? Well, there are actually ways that we could, maybe tell Flask to pass in parts of that thing as a thing. Because again, remember, all we're conceptually doing is we're getting get /fib/20, right? Get /fib/30. Get /fib/21, whatever it is, right? Whatever that number is. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just say, hey, Flask, anything that starts with /fib, that's going to run the getFib function, right? And then, by the way, it's going to take in some number. And what I want you to do is I want you to map that in. I want you to map that into that function, right? So that it calls that function with that that thing as a parameter, Well, there is a way to do that. Now, every single web server language you could possibly use is going to do this differently. But the nice thing about being a programmer, again, is we have Google. So what I'm going to search for is Flask. And I happen to know that this is called a route parameter, is the way that things usually call it. And we'll go through and we'll just search for it. Part of being a programmer as well is just getting good at Googling things. And part of it is also knowing enough about what you're doing so that you actually can Google it. So we're just going to scroll down and see if we can find... Okay, here we go. Check this out. And it looks like we can even tell it we want it to be an integer, right? So we use these little pointy braces. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get rid of this. Or sorry, that can stay. Fib/number. And I think number might be a reserved word, something that Python won't let us use, so we'll just call it num. We can even just call it n. And this will take as input in. And again, it looked like, just from looking at these examples, because sometimes looking at examples is easier than reading the whole documentation, and as always, programmers are lazy. It's easier to test something, and if it doesn't do what you think, then you read the full documentation. Looks like if we start it with int : we can make sure that this is not a string. So what this does then is we tell it, we've done exactly what we were hoping to do. We told it to map in this n into this parameter. So now what we can do, if I restart this, let's go to /fib/20, and it should still work. Oh, we get an error. Let's see. Argument must be a string or a number. /fib/20. Oh, sorry. We left this here, where we're assigning n to the value of that question mark. So we'll restart it. /20, /17, /4, /29, right? Got all those really cool things. We can also, again, maybe we don't want someone to calculate n over 35, let's say, because again, we have that problem, right? What can we do here, by the way? We can do if n is greater than 25, turn no. Right? Go ahead and restart. Right? So we said it's greater than 25, maybe we'll make it 35 because it seemed like 25 was fine. Again, every time we go up one number, this is going to take slightly more than twice as long to calculate. So 29 should still work up until 34. 34 has taken a while. Okay, it did return. 35 will return. 35 will take twice as long as 34. And then 36, it'll be like no. So again, don't forget to add in that what we called input validation. And in fact, in this case, maybe I want to say or n is less than 0, 1. N is less than 1. Oh, that is n is greater than 1. N is less than 1. Put some space here, make it look a little bit nicer. And okay, now we get our thing. So I'm going to show you one more really cool thing that we could do. We'll talk a little bit again about some things that maybe your next steps that you could try out. And then finally, we will go to Q&A. So one more thing that you could do. Let's say that we have a bunch of pages and all of them are going to have the same general structure, right? They're going to have maybe a navigation link. And they're going to have maybe your name in the header. So as an example of this, by the way, let's go to our website, SRND. And you can see that no matter what website I go to, they all have this header. They all have this footer down here. Some of them, for example, this one, they all have this little link on the side, right? And no matter what page I go to, they're all going to have the same general format. We would call this a template. And one of the nice things that we can do with languages like this, with Python with Flask, is we can actually just make our own template. Now there are ways to do this automatically. Template, let's see if there's a default way. There are. So Flask has this really powerful system, it looks like, for generating templates. And you could learn all of this, and this is something that you could do. But we're going to do it the naive way, just to show you proof of concept-wise how this could potentially work. So we're going to call this template response. So what we'll do is we'll take a response, and we will wrap it around. We will wrap a template around it, and then we'll return it. So what is our template going to be? Well, I'm going to do this again the simplest possible way. H1, I'm going to put my name, right? And then we'll have maybe an A. We won't even worry about that for right now. We're just gonna do this one thing. We're gonna put this title on every single page on the site, right? So we're gonna return that plus the response plus, we'll put a paragraph. Maybe even, by the way, maybe the response should always be in a paragraph tag. Or even just to make it more clear, we'll put it in an H2 just so that you can see how it changes. So response will be in an H2 tag, and now we will put a P, and we'll do a copyright symbol. So what we've done now is anything that calls this function, this template response function, right? It'll take a response as input, and it will return as output that response variable, but with this string in front of it and this string after it. So now what we can do is, instead of this, we can do return, what do we call our function now? Template response. Return template response of this thing. And on this greeter function, which is on our main thing, we can return, and even get rid of that HTML. Template response. Now we'll go ahead and run this. So again, both of those functions that we just made are now calling this template response function. And they're gonna give it as input whatever we want the output of the page to be. But now the cool thing is, if I refresh this, shouldn't have done 35. 35 takes a while. But there you can go. There you go. There you can see it, right? And now if I do 1, you see, again, it's 0. And if I go to just the home page, it says hi there. And every single one of them has our title. It has the copyright at the bottom. So that's also really cool, right? And again, there are more powerful ways of doing this. But what we have just done is we have made this code reuse sort of thing into a function that we can use to even reuse HTML code. So every single page is going to have the name. The other cool thing about this is, let's say that I have 50 pages on the website and I want to give it a more Startup 2.0 sort of name. So instead of calling it Tyler's site, I'm just going to call it TLR, right? Remove all the vowels. That was the trendy thing to do back in like 2005. Check that out, right? Now it's got this new name, but if I go back to this other page and I refresh, it's also got my new trendy, Startup 2.0 name. Or the newest version would be Tyler.ai, right? That's the 2018 version. So let's say that I want to upgrade this to 2018. Well, check that out, right? I got my website, again, it's updated absolutely everywhere. And potentially I could make this look good. And the way to do that would be I'd update it just in this one place, and then every single page would have that, right? Which is, again, pretty cool. So we can do a lot of cool things to just sort of like reduce the amount of work that we have to do as programmers, because programmers are very lazy. I really cannot stress that enough, and it is strongly encouraged to all of you to be lazy programmers and to really try to reuse your code as much as possible, because doing it in this one place is actually going to make everyone's life easier later on. So we are running near the end of our workshop. Someone was just asking about CSS. We'll get to that later as well. But yes, you could put CSS in here. You could put CSS in a separate file. We'll get to that in Q&A, and I'll actually talk about how we would do that. So before we get to Q&A, I just wanted to talk about what are some cool things that we could... This focused on the wrong screen. There we go. What are some cool things that we could actually be doing with this that maybe are a little bit more advanced than calculating the Fibonacci sequence, which I'm sure that none of you have ever wanted to do in your life on your website. So again, the templating thing is pretty cool. We can do cool stuff with that. It's useful. It'll save you a lot of time later. But again, it's still not the world's most cool thing. So some other things you could do: user accounts, right? You can store information about different people somewhere. You could use a database, which is something that we have a workshop on. Don't remember when. I'll double check on the calendar in just a second. But you could store information in a database, and then you could retrieve it. Or if you don't even want to use a database, by the way, you could use just static. You could use like a JSON file, or you could even write your own file format and just store it somewhere, right? And then you could actually go and read it out later. So that's one cool thing. You could have like user accounts for your own service. What are some other cool things that we could do with this? Well, again, one example would be we could actually go to the Spotify API, which we'll have a workshop about how APIs work coming up next week. And we could actually go and grab information about what song you're listening to right now, And I know people who do that on their web page. I actually used to not have my currently listening, but I had what songs I've listened to the most in the last month. It's kind of a cool bit of information for to share with people, because I think a lot of us are really proud of the music that we listen to. If you're really into music, at least you are. You could display your rankings in multiplayer video games. That's another thing, right? You could display live information from Facebook so that when you update your Facebook page, it updates your website automatically. Or LinkedIn. I'm sure that none of you have a LinkedIn yet, but it is something that eventually you should create because it's helpful. And you could have, your work history automatically populated. You could automatically generate your entire resume, because I know that all of us hate making resumes if you've ever made one, and your school will probably force you to make one at some point if you haven't. So we could automatically generate our resume, and then when your school tells you a resume, you just go to that page on your website and print it out, and there you go, right? You could make the next Facebook. You could make the next Snapchat. You could make the next Instagram. All of these things will require code that's running on a web server. All of these things can use basically this exact same format. It's super, super, super cool because we can do a lot more dynamic things now. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get to Q&A. I'm going to answer the 2 questions that came in earlier. If you have more questions, feel free to ask them. Just on the note of the most recent message about stalking my LinkedIn, by the way, do feel free to add me on LinkedIn because it's helpful. Someone will talk about this actually in the workshop on Friday about getting an internship, how useful it is to just add people on LinkedIn and ask them for introductions. So definitely check out that workshop on Friday. Okay, so questions from earlier in the thing. Why would you use Python over JavaScript or vice versa? So first of all, you can technically use JavaScript on a server. It is technically possible to run it like this, where it's receiving HTTP web requests and it's running functions based on those. It is technically possible, and the thing that you would use for that is called Node.js, Node.js. And the reason for that is if you just really like the format of the JavaScript programming language, but you want to use it for a web server. It won't let you do anything that Python won't let you do. The only thing that will change about it is the format. And by the way, you can use Java, you can use C#, almost any programming language can technically be used to make a web server. Now JavaScript is special because it also runs in the web browser. So if you're using just JavaScript embedded into an HTML page, there are some advantages and disadvantages to that versus using JavaScript embedded in Node.js, right? The advantages of using JavaScript on your web page is that it runs on the user's computer and it's often quite fast. So when you think about it, having to go to a web server, having the web server calculate the Fibonacci sequence, and then having that get sent back to the user is actually kind of a slow and inefficient way to do something that doesn't contain any sensitive information. For things like that, it might make more sense to do it in JavaScript, because then you reduce the ability to do that. You reduce the need to have that web request, because web requests are slow. They are not very fast. In fact, if I actually go, one of the cool things that you'll notice about the SR&D website, if I go to our website, it loads almost immediately. And when I go to any web page of our website, it loads almost immediately. So that's because nothing on this website is dynamic. It is all using those templates, and we're using a really fancy way of generating those. But when it comes down to it, everything on this is actually turned into static HTML by a program using something called Gatsby, which we did a workshop on last week if you want to learn it, but it's way more advanced. Everything was turned into static HTML using a program, but it's all using JavaScript to navigate between these pages. So when I go to srnd.org, it actually downloads all the information for the other pages, and it will render them all in JavaScript, which makes them almost immediate. Literally, I'm not using a super fast internet connection here. It's a reasonably speeded internet connection. And when you compare this to something like the CodeDay website, which uses a Python-style format where every page has to be rendered on the server and returned back, the CodeDay website is super slow. It's actually way slower than it should be, and it's something that's being worked on right now. But compare how long that takes, right? Or go to CodeDay Colorado. Compare how long that took to how long it takes to go to a website here. So that's one of the major disadvantages of using a web server over JavaScript, is that a web server is often quite a bit slower. What are some of the advantages of using a web server? One, if you do want to do anything where you're using those templates, it's usually much easier to do it in a web server than it is to use it in JavaScript. There are some things that you can use to automatically generate it for you, but it's more complicated. and it's not a super beginner-friendly thing to do. Another major advantage is that you can store sensitive information. So if you have a password, and you're connecting to a database, and that database has sensitive information, you cannot do that in JavaScript. You don't want to be connecting to a database in JavaScript because all JavaScript code is all sent to the user, and they can just look at it. And there are ways to make it a little bit harder to understand what's going on. But if you're connecting to a database, for example, you do not want to do that in JavaScript in a web browser because anyone can just look at your username and password, connect to your database, and delete everything. It's bad. You don't want to do that. So anything that has any sort of permissions or any sort of sensitive information, like your Spotify password, again, that's another reason. That's a really strong reason to use a web backend. Another reason is certain things just cannot be done in front-end JavaScript. So for example, using that example of connecting to Spotify API, even aside from the fact that you probably need private credentials to do it, security restrictions inside of the web browser, I don't know why I put that in air quotes, security restrictions inside the web browser will not let you do that. It will not let you connect to the Spotify website. It will not let you connect to the Overwatch leaderboards or anything like that, just because you could potentially, then use JavaScript to steal sensitive user information to whoever is currently logged in. So you would have to do that on the back end. There are just certain things that, because of security reasons, cannot be done on the web browser. So those are two pretty good reasons. There are probably others, but those are probably the two most common ones. I guess one other really common one would be maybe you have a website and a mobile app, and you want both of them to talk to what we'd call like a backend API, which again we'll talk about next week in a workshop. If you were to make it on a something like Python or Flask, you could actually just have maybe some front end JavaScript that does connect to this backend to do things, which is a little bit more complicated. But one other advantage is you can kind of share some logic between, share some code between your mobile apps and your website, which would be another reason. There was another question. What was it? What about CSS? So the two ways to do CSS are, one, you can embed it in every single page that you do in the template, which is probably bad. Or two, you can actually configure Flask so that it will kind of be a hybrid, right? It'll be like Apache where you can make a .css file and store it in a specific directory, and Flask will go out and just get that file and it will return it back whenever you say it. But it will also still in some situations run functions. So there are ways to do that. Let's see if we can figure it out ourselves together, because again, I haven't used this very much. Flask static files. And look at that. There is a way to do it. Here's what we do. We make a folder called static. So we have this folder called static. And I'm going to use this thing over here. We're going to add a file name called index.css. And what we'll do is we'll just make the body background color red. If you don't know what this is about, again, we had a workshop yesterday. I'd recommend checking that out. Now what we'll do over in our template, where is our template? Did that get undone for some reason? There we go. Over in our template, we will, we'll just test this first and we'll see how we actually link to this. So we run our web server and we go to our URL, and we'll just go ahead and copy here. Paste it. We get our URL as before, /static/index.css. And you can see that it does actually load the file from there. So that's how you would do it in Flask, is you would just put it inside of a static folder, and then anything inside that folder you can just reference directly. It's not going to run a function. So link rel equals stylesheet, href equals /static/index.css. I know that this line is super long. There are ways of doing multi-lines in Python. I'm not going to do it for this example. Go ahead and restart it, refresh our page, and you can see that it's actually loaded in this /static/index.css. And now we've got the world's most beautiful website. So that is how you would do static files like a CSS file in Flask. You could also generate the CSS, by the way. It doesn't have to generate HTML. You could theoretically generate the CSS, You could theoretically generate, again, we've already generated the HTML. You could theoretically generate just plain text. And you could theoretically generate more complicated things like PDFs. And that's actually something that you can do at Code Day, which is super cool. Not you as a participant, but volunteers for Code Day, we actually just automatically generate promotional posters for them. So they create a promo code, and it will automatically generate a PDF that says, here's Code Day, it's on this date, and use this promo code for this % off, and here's the address of the space. All that gets generated automatically using the exact same format, because you can just generate anything you want. It doesn't have to be HTML. And then you still load it over HTTP, so you go to, /mysite, mysite.com/poster.pdf, and promo code is equal to CodeLabs, and it will automatically generate that all, and it'll return it for you as a nice PDF that you can print out. So you can do anything you want. You could generate the CSS dynamically, or you could use that static folder. Same thing for images. If you wanted to host images, you'd probably put them in the static folder, but theoretically you could automatically generate an image as well. Any other dropped out this. Any other questions, comments, concerns, anything else that I can answer about HTML, CSS? While you're doing that, I'm just going to quickly pull up our calendar for upcoming workshops. Okay, so since there doesn't seem to be anything else coming in, just a few notes. One, again, if you're watching this recorded, feel free to join us, chat.srnd.org. It is completely open. You just need to register for a totally free account, and we will answer any questions that you have about programming. We will be any help that we can possibly be. We are happy to help out and, to just kind of help you make cool things, because that's what we're all about. So feel free to do that if you're missing this live, or if any other questions come up later. Tomorrow, we have a workshop on Docker. So basically, you can see how we just made this web server, right? We just made this in Python. How do we get this on the internet? Because this is accessible to us, but this is not accessible to other people. And what if we want to update that? And what if we want it to be the size of Facebook and have like hundreds of millions of people constantly visiting the website? Well, there's a really cool technology for doing all of those things called Docker. It's very new, as in like the last few years, and it is very likely that you will never learn about this in school. They probably won't teach it to you in high school or in college, and they almost certainly will never teach you in high school. And so if you have any interest in learning Docker and being well prepared for to be an intern at some cool company, and being well prepared to walk in the door wherever you go to work and have everyone be like, wait, you already know Docker? That's cool. We have a workshop on that tomorrow at 12. It'll be taught by TJ Horner, who's actually our intern, who converted all of our stuff into Docker containers. And by the way, I do not personally even know how to use Docker, because it was not something that anyone used when I was learning to program. So I'm going to be there at that website to learn how to use it as well. All programmers are constantly learning new things. It's kind of part of the cool stuff of being a programmer. On Thursday, we're going to have a workshop, again at 12 Pacific. All of these are at 12 Pacific. 12 Thursday, we are going to have a workshop on Unity. And so Unity is this really cool system for making video games. And when I say making video games, I mean like actual real people use video games. And yeah, to answer your question, yes, it will be streamed live here today. If you want to get notifications, you can get them if you're in CodeLabs and you have a mentor and whatever else, you'll be on our mailing list already. You can get them in the chat. We'll just CC everyone who's here. Or you can follow and subscribe on Twitch, and you will get a notification whenever we go live. So definitely feel free to do that. So that'll be live streamed here tomorrow, the Docker one, Thursday the Unity one, professional game making toolkit, real live games like that you can buy on Steam and on Switch, and on all sorts of platforms. All of them actually use Unity to do it, and it's really great. And you can build VR games, you can build Switch games, you can build, I think, Xbox games, you can build mobile games, you can build web games, all of them in 2D or 3D, for VR even. All of these can be built in Unity, and again, it's a professional tool that real games use that are like, there are even like games that have like $1 million budgets that use Unity. It's really, really great, and it's free for personal use and for students. So we're going to have that workshop on Thursday. We'll make a really basic game and get you started. And then finally, on Friday of this week at noon Pacific, we have the Getting an Internship in CS workshop taught by a former Code Day attendee, Fedor Paretsky. And he was in high school and managed to get an internship. He has been working on getting an internship, many years in college as well, as many people in college do. And he has some advice for you on what to do if you want to get an internship, particularly if you're not following a traditional path. So that means if you're in high school and want to get an internship, or if you're in college and not pursuing a CS degree or not currently in your major for a CS degree, if you want to get an internship and you don't have that traditional be in the CS program at a high-ranking college and like MIT or something. If you're in the CS program at MIT, it's not very hard to get an internship. If you're not, it's a little bit harder. He's going to give you advice for how to do that. Alexa, create an event. So it's going to be on Friday, and we have another week of workshops coming up next week. The schedule for that is not fully finalized as we add and remove more workshops. So that will be announced on Saturday, the schedule for the next week. As always, again, don't forget to subscribe on Twitch, and you will get notified whenever we go live. And also, we've been talking with Twitch about partnering with them for a bunch of Code Day stuff, and so it will make them happy as well, because I can be like, look how many subscribers we have. So that we can work with them a little bit more closely on some Twitch stuff at Code Days. Other than that, again, a reminder to go ahead and join chat.srnd.org to talk with us and other cool community people, other people who watch these videos, and check out previous workshops on youtube.com/studentrnd. Hope to see you at the workshop tomorrow on using Docker, where I will actually be in the chat rather than a person presenting. And other than that, I will see y'all tomorrow.